a wonderful paper. And also thanks for finishing early because I have too many slides actually, so that's great. So let me start by clarifying what I think the scope of the disagreement between Herman and Simon is. By Herman, I mean something like Capellan endeavor convention. So I think they can agree that the following hypothesis is plausible. Human actions are guided by implicitly egocentric or first-person redundant representations of affordances. That might be true. So what the real disagreement is about, and here I'm saying something which I think is similar to what Rachel said in comments on Eros, the disagreement is more about the modal force or the justification basis of this kind of hypothesis. So Simon thinks that there is a relatively a priori argument. By relatively a priori, I mean something like armchair, which shows this sort of hypothesis to be true. And here Herman would strongly disagree, I think. So he says things like this: there's no such thing as doing psychology about very general truths about human beings without empirical backing. Whether indexicality is involved, an action is a very, very detailed question about the implementation of complicated mechanisms in the human head. So I think we have a clear disagreement here. So Simon's argument, very clearly set out, but for those who weren't paying too much attention, very roughly it goes like this. There's two main steps. First step, Simon tries to show that the representation of affordances is essential to action. In the second step, he tries to show that affordances have to be represented in a special, implicitly egocentric way on pain of vicious regress. Hence, implicitly egocentric representations are essential to action. So I'm mostly going to focus on the very first step here. But part of what I say, I think, will be relevant to the second step as well, at least in as much as you need, I think, the first step to get to the second step. So must we represent our affordances in order to act? Well, Simon says things that I think sound very plausible. Any creature that uses its body to perform actions on its immediate environment must be sensitive to its relations to its environment, otherwise it would not be able to act in the right way. That certainly sounds reasonable. And here's an intuitive example from John Perry. Consider an interaction with a fax machine. To press certain buttons on it, I have to move my fingers a certain distance and direction from me. It isn't enough to know where the buttons were relative to one another or where the fax machine was in the building or room. I had to know where these things were relative to me. In here, there's a response, well, to Perry, but it also has something to, it can count, I think, as somewhat of a response to Simon. So here's what Herman says: you shouldn't be moved by this kind of rhetoric. In order to act, our bodies have to be brought into engagement with the world around us. That much is trivial. And this is the important part, but what is not trivial is that for that to happen, we must represent ourselves in relation to the objects we engage with. Why do you need to know or have a belief about where the buttons are relative to you? In general, we don't need to have knowledge or beliefs of all the facts involved in our action. For instance, you don't represent all your muscle movements when you act. So I think this, in the current context, is highly controversial. I think it's an insight, and I'm going to try to build on that insight in response to Simon. So he says a few things that are critical of Herman. One thing he says, which, well, is a good point, he says, well, Herman confuses the folk explanation of action with its serious metaphysics. And so I agree, that's a distinction we should make. Here I'm going to introduce just a little bit of terminology I'm going to need, or distinction. So let's distinguish different kinds of intentions. And I'll talk about intentions, but you can apply the same kind of distinction to pretty much any representation involved in action, I think. So on the one hand, we have allocentric intentions. For instance, I intend that John Perry send a fax. And these are just intentions that represent actions in an entirely objective or impersonal way. That's just what I mean by allocentric. And I think we all agree that I don't need to represent my affordance relations to Perry or the fax machine in order to form that A intention. But on the other hand, you might think, well, we don't just have allocentric intentions, we have something like motor intentions. That's a concept I borrow from Elisabeth Bechery. And these we might not usually express linguistically, but it's something like the intention I formed to send a fax immediately by moving my fingers thus and so. And as Bechery would say, M intentions are based on affordances and they're represented in an implicitly egocentric way. So with that distinction in hand, I think we can rephrase Simon's criticism. Even if many perfectly acceptable folk explanations of action only mention the A kind of intentions, that certainly doesn't show that M intensions aren't really necessary for action in the metaphysical sense. That's a good point, but I think explanation is a red herring here. I think we can rephrase the point without talking about explanation at all, simply directly as a claim about the constitutively necessary conditions for action. So to claim something like this, some creatures could conceivably act on the basis of A intentions alone, hence without representing their affordance relations. And then, whether humans are such creatures is an empirical question. So you'll note that Péchery provides empirical arguments from neuroscience and the like for the claim that human actions involve M intentions. So let's forget about explanation, focus on the metaphysics of action. Now, I think there's two ways to interpret Herman's point. There's a modest way, which is that what they suggest is that affordances don't need to be represented at the personal level. And Simon considers this, and so he discusses the issue of grip aperture. And certainly you can imagine that such representations are subpersonal, drawing roughly on Milner and Goodale. And we might, of course, conceivably generalize that model, and imagine that all our representations of affordance relations are subpersonal. So that's at least conceivable. And Simon's response is he just grants that affordances could conceivably at least be represented merely at the subpersonal level. Still, as long as affordances have to be represented somehow, that's enough, right? So subpersonal representations could very well be essential. However, the point I'd like to make here is that once you grant the modest interpretation, it's really not so hard to get to a stronger interpretation, which is more problematic. So if you grant that affordances can be represented only subpersonally, it seems difficult to resist a stronger claim. So one thing you might note is that a lot of the things that people call subpersonal representations, we might not want to call representations at all, but I'll leave that to the side. More importantly, if a function can be carried out via subpersonal representations, it's certainly conceivable that the same function be carried out non-representationally, and I have in mind the idea we can rely on favorable background conditions, natural constraints, or as the people who did situation theory sometimes call these things, unarticulated non-constituents. People don't seem to use that notion anymore, but it's not the same as an articulated constituent. It's just something like a background condition. So for example, we can certainly conceive of a creature in which grip aperture is not guided through representations, but by grip gnomes. These are creatures who live in symbiosis with us, like pilot fish and sharks, and they go around and they adjust our grip whenever necessary. So I take it that if there were grip gnomes, maybe they're invisible, who knows, grip affordances would not have to be represented. Grip aperture adjustment would be taken care of by environmental factors, not cognitive ones. And so this brings us to Lewisian gods. If you generalize this grip gnome model to every physical action, you get a creature that's very much like a Lewisian god. So a god, I think, has a body, it acts within space and time. Lewis' story, it throws down mana, but it never needs to represent affordances. So a god, in my terminology, just acts on the basis of A intentions alone. It doesn't need M intentions because of extraordinary environmental cooperation. Lots and lots of gnomes. And these gnomes somehow ensure that its A intentions are reliably carried out. So here the question, I think, is a god really a conceivable agent? And Simon says no, and he gives a fairly detailed argument. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm simply going to flag what I think the main reason is why he's skeptical of godly action. It's something like this. Lewis's gods lack an ability to judge how to go about performing their actions. This is what distinguishes deliberate action from random thrashing about, as he puts it. And he reiterates a similar claim later on. He says, in order for the action to be deliberate, the god must know how to do what it intends to do. So I think Simon is appealing to something like the following principle. Unless you represent some means by which to do P, then you cannot intentionally or deliberately do P. But I think that principle is just false. I think basic actions falsify the principle of the necessity of means representation. So I'm not going to give you a precise definition of what I mean by basic actions. I hope some people have some idea of that concept. I'm just going to give a nice quote by Doug Lavin, who gives you some idea of what I mean. No means are taken in the execution of a basic action. It is not done by doing anything else. And as he puts it, There is no answer to how when asked of it. Similar quote by Dretske, a chief executive officer can get his employees to do certain tasks without knowing or caring how they do them. Indeed, as we all know, a hierarchical arrangement of executive responsibility is an efficient way to organize command structures. It is also an effective way to design the mechanisms responsible for behavior. So I think for a God, actions corresponding to A intentions, such as the A is moved closer to B case that Simon mentioned, are basic actions, and M intentions play no role. In other words, a Lewisian God is an executive who leaves it to its employees, vector mechanisms / gnomes, whether, for example, A or B is to be moved, so long as A is moved closer to B somehow or other. Well, I think Simon would say, wait a minute, that's really strange. And here I'd like to insist that it's maybe not so strange after all. So granted, the gods are somehow estranged, as Lucy O'Brien puts it, from their own actions, since they're unaware of the means which serve their allocentrically represented ends. But the important point is that we are just as estranged from the pre-intentional underpinnings of our basic motor actions. I think that's a way of reframing what Herman says. And indeed, if you see how Levin describes the predicament of a basic agent, a subject of basic action would be alienated from the progress or getting done of his deeds. He might have awareness of the material processes that bring actuality to his ends, yet such awareness would be of something alien, outside, and external. So the God's alienation doesn't show that it's missing anything essential or constitutive to actions, just that actions that are not basic for creatures like us are basic for the God. In other words, basic action is still, conceivably at least, a kind of action. I think this suggests, well, maybe a moderate conclusion, somewhere between Simon and Herman. So against Simon, I don't think his argument shows that the representation of affordances is essential or constitutive to action. Nevertheless, against Herman and for Simon, we don't need to answer any very, very detailed question about the implementation of complex mechanisms in the human head in order to surmise that human actions are in fact guided by implicitly egocentric representations of affordances. So I think as a matter of engineering, it's unclear how nature could build gods. So how would the gnomes go about detecting the godly A intentions exactly? I'm not sure. For embodied agents in an uncooperative environment, so if you don't have the right unarticulated non-constituents, it's better to use representations of affordances or M intentions to ensure that our A intentions are carried out. In other words, so-called essential egocentricity, maybe that's better than indexicality, is a plausible hypothesis about human cognition, which can be arrived at without too many costly empirical assumptions, and maybe that's just fine. I'd like to end simply on a slightly more skeptical coda. Is the essentiality of egocentricity quite as pre-theoretically intuitive as I said, or is it weird? I'm using weird here in a technical sense that some of you may be familiar with from this influential paper in BBS. Weird people are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. So in this paper, they point out that speakers of English and other Indo-European languages favor the use of an egocentric relative system to represent the location of objects, that is, relative to the self. In contrast, many, if not most languages favor an allocentric frame. In data and spatial reference systems from 20 languages from diverse societies, only 3 languages relied on egocentric frames as their single preferred system of reference. And all 3 were from industrialized populations, so they point out that maybe weird people are unusual in their egocentric bias. Now, that's not much of an argument, but it's an interesting data point at least. And some people who have worked on this, like Levinson in particular, draws strong conclusions. He says Kant was wrong to think that the structure of spatial regions framed on the human frame, and in particular the distinctions based on left and right, are in some sense essential human intuitions. That's worth thinking about, I think, at least. So weird philosophers, like most of us, should at least be cautious of relying too much on their armchair intuitions about whether or not egocentricity is essential. Maybe the essentiality of egocentricity is not so pre-theoretically obvious after all. Thank you.